Any questions before we start? We're good. Okay. So we finished with this, the Russians and the Caucasus, um, which, of course, was not great for anybody there. A Russian push for the Black Sea, so everybody in the middle was just in the way, which resulted in all sorts of genocide, because that's what Russia's good at. And as I mentioned, Dagestan and Chechnya continue to this day to be extremely dangerous places because the fighting is still happening. Now, I meant to get to this before the end of last time, but it's definitely was too much to do with the time we had left. So the Sepoy Rebellion. This was a pretty major turning point for not just Britain, but these crown colonies as a whole. So as I said, India was this model colony for Britain. It had been making huge profits, and while it was pretty expensive to pacify and administer, and they were building, schools and hospitals and civil service buildings and trains and whatnot, it was making a ton of money, so it was worth it. 1857, though, problems started happening. So by they I mean the British military, well, East India Company, started using a new standardized cartridge for their rifles. I've got an image of what that looked like, but basically, rather than have you've got your powder over here and you've got your shot over here, then you also had to have a separate place where you kept the wad that you would put between the powder and the shot. So whenever you went to reload, you'd have to put the gun down, and I think you actually would put a wad in first, and then the powder, and then another wad, and then the ball, and then another wad to make sure that it was all nice and tight. And then, of course, you'd ram it down, and then you'd shoot. With this cartridge, it all came in a paper or so it was like a paper slip, and you would bite the end off of it and pour it down. And it had the wad in it, it had the powder, and then at the other end it had the ball. It was all just one simple motion. However, so that all that would stay lubricated, it used some kind of fat, because this is the 1800s, so they had to use some kind of animal fat in order to lubricate it. Now, there were two kinds of animals that they would probably use fat from. Either cow fat, which was a problem because most of India is Hindu and cows are sacred to Hindus, or pig fat, and that was seen as unclean to the Muslims, and that is the other major ethnic/religious group in India. So you're pissing off one of two very large groups. And considering that it was rumors, you're pissing off both, because they don't know what it is. And no one's clarifying. Also, it's the 1800s, so even if someone did clarify, it wasn't going to get spread past the rumors. And as I said, the soldier had to bite the top off of it to open it, so they were going to get it in their mouth. Again, for a regular British soldier, who they didn't care, but obviously for a Hindu or a Muslim, if it was one or the other, it was going to be a problem. So in May, 85 soldiers were sentenced to 10 years hard labor for refusing to use the cartridges, and the lead objector was hanged. So, yeah, rather than just be like, oh, hey, we're going to discharge you from the army for refusing to do what we tell you, they sent 85 to hard labor for 10 years and killed the guy that was leading the not even rebellion, just the protest. Obviously, this response caused a much larger response across all of India. Um, there were atrocities on both sides. Again, the Indian population is massive, so they were able to really do a number on the British. However, the British were still there in large numbers and had a lot of firepower, so they killed a lot of civilians. There was no real danger of Britain actually losing control of India, but it still took a year to actually, a year and a half to put the revolt down. So after this ended, Parliament took direct control over India, and began pouring funds to modernize India's infrastructure, but they were less focused on trying to modernize India's culture because clearly that would potentially cause problems. Here I have the image of the rifle as well as the cartridge over here. Again, it's all, there we go. It's all together. You got the case, the powder, the bullet, and then the grease is all on the outside. So you could just dump it all at once into the gun rather than having to take literally multiple minutes to do it. But the issue was, again, what's the grease from? So there's all sorts of images and stories from the conflict. This is a British post being overrun, where they're portraying the Indians as like barbaric, and the British as, of course, heroic. I don't know why a woman and child were at a British like military post, but whatever. Also, I remember this distinctly from one of my British Empire courses. One of the ways that the British would often execute Indian rebels was to tie them to the front of cannons and set off the cannons. And the reason for this was I'm not super familiar with like Hindu belief, but I know at least part of Hindu belief is that your body needs to be whole in order to properly ascend. So just to mess with these people's religious beliefs, they would literally blow up a person. So yeah, it was bad. I mean, again, it wasn't like India had its independence because they were going to fight off the British. The British were still very much in control, but it was a year and a half of really brutal fighting. And there were certainly instances of like Indian soldiers trapping like British civilians in, say, warehouses or churches or whatever and burning them down. But you know, again, it was both sides. It was bad. Speaking of those doing the fighting, and I actually talked about this in my American history class just a moment ago, Europe had a, quote, long peace between 1815 and 1914, basically post-Napoleon and pre-World War I. There was no real major war happening in Europe. We did mention, like the Franco-Prussian War and actually the multiple wars leading up to that. But across the rest of the world, there was lots of wars when it came to imperial expansion. And these soldiers who were sent out to fight these were typically lower class. They either were doing their best to get out of poverty or often in debt, and the only way they could get out of that was to go and fight. Certainly nothing like modern, say, American military, where it's like, oh, if you go and fight and die for us in some desert country for oil, we'll pay for your college, I guess. even though apparently that isn't quite as true as they claim it to be. I've worked with a lot of veterans, and the benefits are not what they say it is.
Wait, so they don't, like, they go off the U.S. and they pay for their own private college?
Yeah, yeah, and it's very, when you come back, it has to be like certain things. You can't just come back and like do whatever. And then like the VA is very underfunded, to say the least.
So they don't fund the college price?
Well, I mean, not the college part, but like if you get hurt, when you get hurt fighting in a war for America and you come back, they're supposed to like pay for your medical bills. They don't. Or if they do, you have to go through so many hoops, you might as well pay for it yourself. Yeah, I know. Like I said, I know a lot of veterans, and it's a nightmare.
Wait, so you're in the military, and you come back, don't you have, like, don't they go back to the military to get reported?
Well, I mean, when you finish your deployment and come back, you're supposed to have all these benefits because you fought for the country.
And you never have to go back again?
Well, depending on like your age and if you were injured and depending on if your discharge, etc. Some people do it like as a career, but like a lot of people go for like a certain number of deployments and then they come back and do something else. It is. That's why you have military recruiters every time we have a job fair, and that's the reason why the national anthems at like every sports game, that wasn't a thing until like the 1990s.
Like, they've been trying to recruit me every single day, but every freaking year.
Yeah. Yep. Yep, I'm not dying for oil, thanks. Yeah, so that's always been a thing. Lower class, people that were desperate, send them off to die for the country. Obviously, the mortality rate for these colonial soldiers was very high. Not just in the fighting, but also in just transit to where they were going, because once again, this is the 1800s, and you got about a 50% chance of dying on the ship just from disease. Also, when you get to the colony you were supposed to be fighting in, there was also like a really high chance you were just going to die from some tropical disease anyway, because you're from like London or whatever, and then you go to sub-Saharan Africa and you get malaria and just die. Also, though, if you manage to not die from disease both on the ship and in the place that you're fighting, the quote backward savages that you were sent there to fight actually often ended up being better equipped and prepared than you were told they would be. Like, oh, they're just going to have spears and loincloths, and we've got guns. And they ended up having guns too because they knew what they were doing. And you ended up getting shot at. Now, while a lot of soldiers were these lower classes from Europe, the vast majority were actually natives, similar to the sepoys, who were either paid or often just coerced into helping the Europeans extend their hold. So it's like, hey, you can either help us take over your homeland or we'll burn down your whole village. So there was a lot of that. Well, yeah, peer pressure, not even that. It was just like, hey, you can help us or you can die along with your entire family and your entire village.
Wait, speaking of diseases, yesterday I went to this thing, because before you start working, you gotta check your blood
Mm-hmm.
and see if you got any diseases in you. Oh my goodness, that hurt so bad.
Yeah, when they take blood, it's...
I couldn't even look. I didn't even look when you took the blood, and it hurt so bad. And I know blood started coming out of me. They, not only one tube, but no, not one tube, two tubes.
Mm-hmm.
Two tubes with my blood in it.
Some some of them are real good at it. I had a nurse up in when I was living upstate. She was like on the second vial before I even realized it. She just like stuck me and yeah.
Yeah,
Some
like I don't feel it when the blood comes out, but I feel it when they put the needle
yeah.
in me.
Some of them are quick.
She got the nerve to tell me I was okay. I'm like, what do they do with the blood anyway? After they test it, they throw it away.
Well, I mean, it wouldn't sound any good once they get done testing it because they go through and they like radiometrically scan it and boil it and all sorts of stuff. So,
So wherever they do that, it smells like blood in that place.
oh yeah,
That's so nasty.
yeah. I mean, then it's whatever's left is disposed of. Yeah,
So they don't send it to people who need it?
but it was not any good for that. And you need a lot more blood than 2 little
I'm
vials.
not good.
Now, if you ever given blood, it's a whole. Have you ever seen like an IV bag? That's one of those.
There's one of those. And how many little tubes fill up that IV bag?
I've got no idea. More than
7.
that. It takes a while to fill up one of them
And that's how
bags.
they gotta give you a snack at the end because it makes you feel lighter.
Mm-hmm.
And they do that. They did that here one time.
Depends. What's your blood type?
I don't know.
Well, if you got O negative, you'll get money.
Bro, you remember here in Centennial, they made a blood drive and
Mhm.
it's like they give you $50.
Well,
You gotta give them. Oh,
I did that, and I found out I was O negative, and now I can go to the one in Florence. That can be $120 per bag.
so what's so special about O negative? What's so special?
Anybody can take it. Like if you had like AB negative, only somebody who's AB negative can take it. But O negative, anybody. A positive, A negative, etc. Anybody can take it.
Well, hopefully, you think I'm gonna get the test results back?
Probably.
What's my job?
I mean, you can find out. Like your daughter could tell you, because yeah, O negative's rare, but it's real good.
Let's see if I got something special.
And apparently, I've also got like an antibody on my blood that is really good for like premature babies. So they do like special drives for that too, which makes my blood worth even more money.
So you give blood, like you give blood regularly?
I try to, yeah.
When you need some extra change, you can put blood in.
It's pretty good. It's pretty nice. And unfortunately, I get headaches a bunch, so I don't go as often as I could. Cause I get a text like every day, hey, you can come give blood. I'm like, not today. I don't feel
You
good.
think people can give blood every day?
No, you can't give blood. It's like, at least for me, it's like every couple of months, because you gotta regenerate your blood.
You give blood, you don't have that much blood, don't you?
No.
Yeah, and then why they oh no.
Well, that's why they need it. So for people that like get in accidents or are in surgery, and
Deer blood.
because you can't have deer blood.
Well,
You're a human.
it was on Twilight where I seen that man drinking deer blood.
Yeah, there's a difference in being a vampire and drinking blood and putting blood in your veins. Here is an image of colonial soldiers hanging out.
Wait, can't they use a deer heart?
No. Your body will not accept that. So this is what I was talking about before. Where since the medieval era, Europeans felt like it was their duty to spread their gospel around the world, especially with the Age of Exploration, where they discovered all these new groups of people that had never heard of the gospel, particularly the New World, the Far East, and of course the Jesuits. Are you familiar with the Jesuits? I like to describe them as, imagine imagine Mormons, where they come to your door and knock and ask if you've heard the good news, except they kick your door down and they have guns.
So they force you?
Yes, but these are specifically Catholics. Now the Jesuits still exist, but when they were operating, yeah, they still exist. But no, they don't be kicking doors down. I mean, that's the analogy. They would like explore the world and go to native tribes and be like, hey, would you like to become Catholics? If not, we'll kill you. That sort of thing. So we had Karl Gutzlaff. He was a German missionary in Asia. He learned the various cultures, languages, and religions. Worked hard to translate the Bible into both Thai and Chinese, which is quite interesting. I had a student who she had learned Chinese, and I think she knew enough of Thai to know that those languages are not actually very closely related. So for a German man to translate the Bible into Chinese and Thai is pretty impressive, because German is not at all related to Eastern languages, and Chinese and Thai are pretty different. I compare that to, like, if you were to learn, say, Spanish, Italian isn't that difficult because they're very similar languages. You could learn Italian pretty easily. There's a lot of words that are identical, some that are at least similar. French is kind of close. Portuguese is pretty close. But something like, say, well, they're all Latin-based, but like a German-based language is different. A Scandinavian language is different. And Thai and Chinese are similar, but pretty. They're not as close as, say, Spanish and Italian.
Was that why it's hard for like Chinese people or like people to learn English?
Mm-hmm. And also because English is both Latin root and Germanic root.
Yeah.
Is French and Anglo-Saxon. Well, not Anglo-Saxon. It's Anglo-Saxon, which are Germanic tribes. So it's a mix of two separate language trees. We also have Dr. David Livingstone, who you may have heard of. He was a missionary, geographer, and opponent of the slave trade, which in the early 1800s was different. However, his most famous feat is getting lost in Africa. He was making his way to find the headwaters of the Nile, because if you're not familiar, the Nile flows north instead of south. It flows from south. The Nile River flows from south to north. Yes, weird. In any case, the reason that this happened, this is actually, I can kind of compare this to modern day. Livingstone was a parasocial celebrity. Whatever he was doing, exploring through Africa, meeting tribes, etc., he would write letters and send them back to England, and they would be published in the newspaper. So everyone in England was reading his letters about his travels in Africa, and then suddenly he stopped sending them back. So suddenly he just disappears. And everyone in England's freaking out because this is their guy, this is their buddy. They all felt like they knew him. So they sent Henry Stanley, who was a reporter, I guess he was the best guy they could send, to look for him, which took 2 years to find him. Eventually found Dr. Livingstone, and is where the famous line, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, because he was the only white guy in Africa. Livingstone continued to stay in Africa until he died, while continuing to look for the headwaters of the Nile. Henry Stanley, while searching for him for 2 years, had apparently done a lot of mapping of the region and was hired by multiple countries later in life to go back to Africa and do more exploration because he had just gotten really good at it. So here is Karl Gutzlaff in his traditional, I guess, Thai outfit. here is Livingstone. And Henry Stanley. Yeah, I always like the story of Livingstone, where like everybody's concerned about him because they'd all been reading about his travels and stuff. It was like he was basically an 1800s version of an influencer. They were all watching his blogs, as it were. And then he disappears, and they all felt like they needed to find him. So, with these various Europeans spreading across the globe, they brought back artifacts, new species, and treasures to their home countries, for science. And while mapping had been a thing that had been going on since at least Greece, probably before, as the world continued to open up, Europeans started to scramble to be somewhere first, to go to an unmapped region and map it out, and to be the first person there, which is to say the first white person there, because obviously there were typically tribes there, but they didn't count. A lot of this got many of these explorers killed because they were just running headlong into areas that hadn't been mapped, and the reason most of them hadn't been mapped because they were largely inaccessible and dangerous. But whatever. So zoology, botany, archaeology all had pretty large boosts during this period. Scientists and explorers going out and finding new species, new archaeological treasures, just trying to find something new. Trying to find something new and exciting and something that had never before been seen, because then that would make them famous. Of course, all this exuberant collecting had downsides. A number of animal species went extinct or became endangered because, well, they were being shot and collected and sent back home, and many cultural artifacts were destroyed or simply pillaged, and, well, the British Museum. Because, hey, the Europeans felt like they were the ones that deserved to have all these cultural artifacts and treasures, and the people that they actually belonged to couldn't properly take care of them. Here we have some etchings of a bunch of various animals. And a lot of these are, let's see, where is... Well, there's an anteater here. I think, I'm not sure if this is an African elephant or an Asian elephant. The ear looks a little bit too small to be an Asian elephant, or African elephant. Soft-shelled turtle, if you ever seen a soft-shelled turtle, they're the ones with the really weird long necks. Obviously a chameleon, which Europeans were not familiar with. Squid. Skate, not exactly a stingray, but related to it. Rhinos, etc. So this is probably African animals. There we have a family just hanging out, having tea on Egyptian ruins. Why not? So, obviously, Europeans are bringing in lots of resources from their various colonies and just pillaging. They're also sending out their, quote, cultural advancement. Sewing machines, railroads, etc. Material items are spread across the globe, as well as new ideals, free trade, popular sovereignty, meritocracy. Basically, they were trying to make the world more European. Obviously, this wasn't the best for everybody. This is when the idea of race as a defining factor got off the ground. The Sepoy Rebellion was seen as being because the Indians were inferior and couldn't look after themselves. Therefore, the British had to be in charge. This is also social Darwinism. That certain races were unable or unfit to govern themselves. That the white races had obligation to rule over them. And this was parodied and summarized in Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden, which, interestingly enough, again, we just talked about in my American history course. But in my American history course, they say that Kipling was like proponent of imperialism rather than parodying it. I don't know. It's like, no, that's Kipling. Kipling was British. Everything he wrote was satire. Anyway, The White Man's Burden is basically saying that, oh yeah, all these inferior races need white man to go and take care of them because that's our duty. But also in the way that he says it, it's like, oh yeah, you need to go send your sons out to die in order to force these people that don't want us there to be our subjects. So yeah, he wasn't exactly a fan. Okay, we talked about the various waves of colonization. Here is the third wave. So Europe has increased industrial output, more stuff to sell, and they're looking for more markets to sell them to. So basically places with lots of population. China and the Ottoman Empire were falling apart. Entrepreneurs were pushing into these regions, which were making money, but also further destabilizing these regions. And all this money allowed for the funding in the Suez Canal and a railway line across the Ottoman Empire. We'll talk more about the Suez Canal in just a minute. So the second industrial revolution, which was the build up from, as my book often, or as my professors often mentioned, instead of like iron and steel, iron and steam, it was steel and gas. So things were stronger, things were more powerful, even faster spread over larger and larger empires, steamships, telegraph wires, Suez Canal. So we're past just like sailing ships and being controlled by the wind and communication being like handwritten notes. It's now telegraph lines, so they're able to travel pretty quickly as long as the telegraph lines don't get damaged. Steamships are significantly faster and more reliable than a sailing ship. The Suez Canal cuts through, right next to Egypt. So rather than having to go around Africa, you can just go through the Mediterranean Sea and pop out right next to Egypt, and now you're pretty much next to India. So it skips literal weeks of travel. Also, medical advance. Cheaply manufactured quinine allowed for Europeans to begin carving into malaria-infested sub-Saharan Africa. So this allowed for Europeans to not die from malaria. Actually, quinine, I should mention, doesn't cure malaria. It just deadens the symptoms that would normally kill you. And so the malaria can be taken care of by your body's natural defenses when normally you would have just died. Because, again, the symptoms are what kill you, the vomiting and the diarrhea, which causes you to dehydrate and then you die. you still feel pretty weak when you get it, but the quinine keeps you from dying, and then your body eventually just takes care of it. Also, the breech-loading rifle and Maxim gun, which is to say, this guy helps you put down any kind of native resistance that would happen. So rather than having to load a rifle from the end, you could now load rifles from the breech, which is to say, more like a more modern gun. Well, still kind of a World War I gun where you kind of load in like a bullet at a time rather than a magazine. But we're getting there. And then, of course, this. So yeah, we're getting into, 1860. We're getting closer and closer to like World War I technology being used for imperial spread. So the Ottoman Empire was also called the sick man of Europe, which is kind of sad. It had been falling apart for a few hundred years at this point, and by the 1830s, it was well and truly on its last legs. Egypt and Tunisia were independent. The Greeks had also won their independence. France had taken Algeria. France and Britain had loaned huge sums of money to the Sultan to keep Russia out, which meant that now they owed France and Britain they owed France and Britain a lot of money, which is going to cause further strains on the economy. So after Egypt had claimed independence, it had racked up tons of debt with Britain and France in an attempt to modernize. So the Khedive Ismail Pasha allowed for the building of the Suez Canal to try to alleviate these debts. This would be a 10-mile long waterway. And as I mentioned, the big thing was that you didn't have to go around the tip of Africa anymore because that was a long trip. And also the southern tip of Africa has some really bad weather, and that's also where great white sharks live, and you don't want to be down there. Not that they would mess with ships, but if you were to go overboard, that would be it. And was especially important for Britain because it meant they could get to India more quickly. And India was like Britain's main focus for the next 100 years. Debts remain unpaid. Britain had to purchase a near-controlling share in the company. There was an uprising in Egypt over this, which Britain ended up crushing because Britain does that when there's an uprising. And then they turned Egypt into a protectorate, which is to say it wasn't officially part of the empire, but they had control over it. So, long story short, this. The British, actually, if I remember right, the French started building the Suez Canal, ran out of money, and then the British finished it, which is actually what happened with the Panama Canal, too. The French started building it, ran out of money, and then America took over and finished it. Which is also what happened in Vietnam. The French had started the war and then ran out of money and left, and then we got involved because we couldn't have the communists take over, and then we lost anyway. But anyway, here are some like 1800s dredgers digging up the canal in the middle of the desert. The Suez Canal is a hell of a thing. Here it is a bit further along. Again, dredging out the canal. And the thing about it, there are some parts of it's not just a 10-mile long canal across the middle of the desert. There's a couple of lakes, I believe, that it empties out into, and then it eventually goes back into the canal. But the reason that ship got stuck, it's been like 2 years now, is because it is across a lot of open, flat terrain, and that creates a lot of wind. And apparently when the ship got buffeted by a huge gust of wind, the steering had given out, so they weren't able to course correct, and it ended up wedged in the canal and blocked the whole thing. So here we have it finished. Let's see. The first vessels through the canal. You've got a bunch of relatively small ships here. You even got like a little rowboat. But you can even see here, like, that's not super wide. So modern ships today, in fact, modern ships today are limited in size by the Suez Canal. Like, if they can't fit through the Suez Canal, they're not built to be any bigger than that. Because if you can't go through the Suez Canal, you got to go around, and that's a lot of work. Unless they're specifically like made to use other routes, never be in this part of the world, in which case it doesn't matter. But like if they're going to be used in this part of the world, they're not too big to go through the Suez Canal. Just they're limited by this size. By a canal that was built in the 1880s. All right. China. So we talked about the Opium Wars in China. But unlike with India, the European powers didn't want to take over mainland China because that's too much to deal with. That's a lot. But with the Qing Empire continuing to weaken, the various European powers and also Japan took over land that China either used to control or at least influence, because in that part of the world, I mean, really until like the 1700s in Europe, borders were kind of fluid. Like there wasn't, this is the line, and on this side is this country, on that side is that country. It was just sort of like, if this country was more powerful, then their influence pushed further. And if this country was more powerful, their influence pushed further back the other way. And if they decided to have an argument about it, they would go to war. That was just how that happened. With China being like the big power in that part of the world, other regions like, say, Korea, which were independent, were not part of China, would still pay tribute to China to remain independent because they were under China's influence. They were within range of China coming in and taking over if they felt like it, but as long as they paid tribute to China, they'd be left alone. However, with China weakening, that influence is receding, and foreign nations, particularly Japan, are starting to take lands that normally China would have an issue with. One of these regions was Vietnam, thanks France. Would have normally taken, well, they did come into conflict with China in the Sino-French War between 1884 and 1885. France proceeded to beat the crap out of China because China was already falling apart. They then took modern-day Laos and Cambodia and created the Southeast Asia Empire, which is a region simply known as Indochina. That's an old term that isn't really used much anymore today, but in maps really up until even World War II, that's just like Southeast Asia. The Dutch were in there, divide and control tactics and their own opium trade. They bribed, coerced, and forced natives of Dutch East Indies to do what they said. Those in Bali and Aceh held off the Dutch for a few years, but eventually the Dutch took over. This is essentially Indochina. You've got Laos, Cambodia. This would eventually become Vietnam. I think this as well, Tonkin. And China, I think, just kind of becomes part of Cambodia. This is all Indochina. which again is just sort of Southeast Asia. Here we go. Now this is again World War II, but this is a good map of, you've got French Indochina, the Philippines, which were an American holding, the Netherlands, Indies, which is like, I guess, Indonesia today. Yeah, this is all Indonesia. So yeah, this is the areas we're talking about. Also, Manchuria was a region that Japan and Russia were kind of getting involved in. I mentioned no, I haven't talked about the Russo-Japanese War yet. That's later. So, the Chinese and Ottoman empires were falling apart. So the lands in Central Asia started opening up because, again, they couldn't influence these areas that far outside of their control anymore. Obviously, the British were concerned because Russia, which was also right there, started to expand, and India was nearby. That was all it took. India was nearby, Russia was also nearby, and that was enough for Britain to get concerned. So this led to a series of intrigue, skirmishes, and pointless bloodshed that Kipling called the Great Game. Basically, a bunch of little proxy wars between the British and Russians that never really led to anything, but was all about the concern that someone might get close to India. One such battleground was Afghanistan, where nothing bad would ever happen again. British moved in 1839 to try to keep the Emir of Kabul from siding with the Russians, which caused the Emir to run over to the Russians. He fled, the British took over, but by 1842 the British had to pull out because the population did not want them there. Again, nothing we'd ever know about. They invaded again in 1878 and then evacuated again in 1881 due to not the Russians, but the Afghani people not wanting them there. This would repeat again in the 1900s. Not necessarily us. The British got involved again in Afghanistan. And I should mention that the Taliban was our creation. America created the Taliban because they agreed to fight against Russia for us, and so we gave them money and weapons. So, FYI. That's why they're there. That's why they have the power they do, because we were afraid of communist Russia taking over the region, so we gave the people there a bunch of money and weapons. It's still the Gulf of Mexico. Nobody calls it that. I mean, nobody with sense calls it that. I mean, I'll just say that the same people that call it that also want to erase anybody that's not white or male from history. So if there was any women that did anything in history, they're no longer included in history. Or if any black people in history, they're also not included in history. Yeah.
You want to take them out of history?
Mm-hmm.
This is real?
Yeah.
Are they taking out Congress?
Well, I mean, just like,
Or they just want to
hey, we don't want this in like museums or history books or like anything that is negative towards America. Well, they're trying. And there's been like displays and stuff at museums that have been changed or altered or. Mm-hmm. because the administration's a bunch of spineless losers that need the past to agree with them. As far as the Russians, they expanded into Turkestan and Transcapia, which are other regions in like Central Asia, but never actually like settled there. They just were like, hey, we are exerting our control here, and the people living there were like, okay, cool, you were already sort of here anyway, and nothing really came of it. These just became shades of either red or blue on the map, depending on how you shaded nations. Typically, Britain was red. That's just how I've always seen it. But anyway, they never really went to war. They just had this was Britain's Cold War, essentially. This was Britain being afraid of Russian expansion and being willing to have a bunch of pointless proxy wars to keep Russia from expanding. That's what this was. So here is the people in Afghanistan not wanting the British there. This is the 100-year Durand Agreement, 1893. So I guess this is what they're going to have Afghanistan as for 100 years. So in 1993, things went to hell again. And then that was us being there. That was the Gulf War, I guess. All right, let's get a little further along before we finish for the day. So, we had the Suez Canal, we had quinine, which allowed for Europeans to actually go, south of the Sahara. There was a diamond rush in southern Africa, which created a lot of interest in Africa, but it was the intrigues of the Belgian king Leopold II that created the true scramble for Africa. And we will get into that in just a moment. So, Leopold was a constitutional monarch. He was, remember, if you recall, he was selected as the the king, not emperor, king of Belgium because he was, not Belgian. He had mixed loyalties and yada, yada, yada. But since he was a constitutional monarch, he couldn't just expand and take land as an emperor would. So he called an international geographical conference in Brussels, where he wanted the Belgians to bring the light of civilization into Africa, which of course he would be at the head of this, not as the Belgian king, but as the head of this stupid conference or whatever. It's, again, just technicalities. Henry Stanley's back. Hired Henry Stanley to go in and map the region. Belgians had a pretty prosperous set of trading stations. However, Portugal and France also had trading posts in the region. And soon the nations were nearing war, because when, European powers are anywhere near each other, the only option is to go to war. Also, Britain decided to back Portugal because why not? They might get something out of it. So, Germany decided to step in and be a neutral ground to, instead of going to war, they would split Africa up. Because nobody lives in Africa, right? Except all the, millions of Africans. So they went to Berlin, and the Europeans, including the Germans, who didn't even have any holdings in Africa, would carve up Africa, and once again would set up lots of issues for the future. So we'll get into that in just a moment. Here's Leopold. There's there's Leopold. That's all I've got. So, the French got a bunch of land in West Africa. Portuguese got land in the southwest Congo. British held on to land along the Nile and from South Africa. Although, due to a German bit of land, they weren't able to fulfill Cecil Rhodes's Cape to Cairo Railroad. Cecil Rhodes was, I think he eventually became, either he was prime minister or was a member of parliament, but he was also like the richest man in England at the time, and he wanted to build a railroad from Cape Town, which is on the southern tip of Africa, all the way up Africa to Cairo, which is in England, wow, in Egypt, because England was gradually getting land all the way up Africa from South Africa, and then all the way down Africa from Egypt, except for, unfortunately for them, Germany got some land in East Africa. Leopold was able to become a king sovereign of a huge Congo Free State. Now, this is where we start getting problems. He was able to make a lot of money in this Congo Free State. However, this is where all sorts of crimes against humanity happened. They were forced to work. Rubber and ivory were the main exports, and basically they had to not plant crops, instead plant rubber trees. And in case you're not aware, you can't eat rubber. Also, ivory comes from elephants, so they had to hunt elephants as well. And had to pay taxes to the new Belgian king. And if they were not able to produce as much as they were supposed to, they would have hands cut off. The atrocities led Joseph Conrad to use the Congo as the setting for his novel Heart of Darkness. If you've not read it, you should, although like with most novels from this era, you may need a strong stomach for reading it because it is rough. Here we have the Scramble for Africa, the various European powers, as well as the Dutch. We'll talk about them in just a moment. So here is Africa post-Scramble. The Congo here in the middle. The English holdings all the way down except for German East Africa, which was right in the middle of what they wanted. Now, it should be noted that Ethiopia managed to hold on to its independence. Ethiopia, as we're going to see, is it going to be this chapter or the next chapter? Spoiling for a little bit ahead, Italy tries to take Ethiopia, and the Ethiopians whip their asses. The Italian army arrives at Adwa, right there at the north, and the Ethiopians had been collecting weapons from like the Europeans around them, and had guns and cannons ready, and fought off the Italians. And there's a mural of that at like it's either it might be at the airport at Adwa, or it's in a museum, but it's pretty neat. And the Italians were real pissed about that, so they came back in World War II and like did a lot of war crimes against them. But hey, they were independent for a while. Here we have a terrible image, but it's important to, this is also in the book, because children were forced to work. And if they didn't produce enough for Belgium, they would lose a hand, because it was seen as they were stealing from what they were supposed to be paying, and therefore, if you steal, you lose a hand. Yeah, this is in the book. The image of African amputees was published by the American writer Mark Twain in his 1905 pamphlet accusing King Leopold II of permitting atrocities to be committed in the Congo Free State. Yeah. What? They cut it off. just held it down and hit it with like a meat cleaver. I mean, they probably would tourniquet it, so they wouldn't bleed out, but it wouldn't be pretty. I mean, if it got infected and they died, well, the Belgians didn't care.
And they did that because why they were stealing it?
No, because they weren't producing as much as they were supposed to, so they blamed it on them stealing it.
But how are they now going to do it if they don't have containers? They don't do it. This is bad.
So they work harder in the future. Well, then I guess they die. Needless to say, this rapid shift from 11% of Africa to 90% of the continent resulted in a lot of resistance. This expansion, change, and imposition of new rules and laws led to resistance. Ethiopia, oh yeah, okay, it is this chapter. Local resistance armed with European guns destroyed an Italian army, which is awesome. Like I said, I've got a really great image for that. Other European powers tried to bribe or otherwise coerce natives into submission, giving them partial control of their new government, of the places they've lived for generations. But hey, we've got a new flag, so you can have partial control over your own land. Needless to say, the Germans had a awful time of it. The Maji Maji uprising in Germany, East Africa, took 2 years to put down. In southwestern Africa, the Herero revolted. They captured several German settlements, so the German troops killed 50,000 Herero men, women, and children, drove the rest into the desert, and poisoned their wells. So when they came back, the water was poisoned. And any survivors were forced into concentration camps. No, to the African natives. 80,000 Herero and 20,000 Nama, which were just a nearby tribe, were killed, which was 80% of the Herero nation. That's basically everybody, which is essentially genocide. Yeah, well, they were supposed to not do that. Like, it's not that, we're going to murder all these people because we can. You can't rule over a people when they're all dead. So it's not that this was Germany showing how strong they were. It was Germany showing how bad they were at controlling people that they were supposed to be ruling over. However, they were still better than Italy, which got their asses kicked. So here we have Ethiopia on the left, and Italy on the right, and the Ethiopians absolutely stomping them. And they've got some Ethiopian saint up here with what looks like a freaking rocket, or I guess maybe it's a spear. It's probably a spear. I don't think they had rockets back then. But yeah, that's pretty rad. We have another unfortunate image, but hey, we're talking about imperialism. So here are the survivors of the Herero nation. These are the people that were put in the concentration camps and then not fed. Yeah. That's if they've got disease. These people were just starving. Yeah. Just skeletal. We've only got a little bit left. I don't know if I can finish it, or if we'll do like one slide and then do the next one on Monday. But let's at least do the Boxer Rebellion. Obviously, China, which was also falling apart, was getting really angry at the foreign nations that were taking over. So the Qing Empire tried to modernize like Japan had done. Um, but in the Sino-Japanese War between 1895 and 1896, were defeated, and it just further weakened the nation. Germans and British sought more concessions, which yet further weakened the Qing Empire. So the nationalists in China felt like the Qing court was the enemy. They were the ones that were bowing to these outside nations and allowing for China to further weaken. So they rallied behind secret martial arts societies such as the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, which were known in the West as the Boxers, because we can't imagine people hitting each other with their hands and not being boxers. These were martial arts societies, so various. I don't know what the specific ones in China would be, but we just call them Boxers because for us it's all this. Began a grassroots resistance movement. They attacked missionaries and foreigners, cutting telegraph lines and railroads. By 1900, this resistance had completely overthrown the empire. So foreign powers, Russia, Japan, Germany, Britain, France, and the U.S. had all sent in troops to deal with this rebellion. And I actually had done some reading on this. And it was, had the foreign powers not gotten involved, they probably would have won. Like they would have been able to overthrow the Qing Empire and create something new. I don't know what it would have been or if it would have been very good, but it would have been something different. However, these foreign nations wanted China to continue to be in its weakened state, so they went in, defeated the rebellion, and they forced China to make more payments to them, which further weakened China. Which is why, in part, China is real suspicious of the rest of the world, because we have treated China like a punching bag for several hundred years. So this is where most of the rebellion had taken place. And in China, that is like several tens of millions of people. So here we have the Boxers, the martial arts societies. Here we have a man about to be executed by the Imperial Japanese army before a mass grave. So when they cut his head off, he falls right into the hole. Here we have it happening in a street. They're just killing the guy in the middle of the street. So that's horrific. We've got enough time for this. We'll do this, and then we'll be done. So diamonds have been discovered in South Africa, and the British decided they wanted that. Can you imagine going to war over natural resources? What a shock, right? So the people living in South Africa at this time were actually Dutch. They were called Boers because they had been in South Africa for so long that they were sort of created their own culture. They weren't, how do I put this? They were not a colony of the Netherlands. They were their own independent region, but they were descendants of the Dutch. They were in a region called the Transvaal. There was a river called the Vaal River, so the Transvaal was beyond the Vaal River. However, the British were actually pushed back in the First Boer War. Cecil Rhodes was Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, which was the southern, beyond that. His friend Leander Starr Jameson tried to incite a rebellion in Transvaal by sending over raiders. However, this didn't go well because this was discovered, and the British were seen as a bunch of warmongers. But it didn't matter because they had war anyway. And the notable thing about this particular war is due to the profitability of the popular press, and also telecommunications, which is to say telegraph lines, the Second Boer War was the most intensely covered and illustrated war to this point. They were taking pictures, they were writing about everything that was going on, and they were sending it all back to England to be published. Winston Churchill, who at this time was a young man, went there as a reporter, but because he was so full of pride for his country, he wanted to join in the fighting. Yeah. I've got a picture of a young Winston Churchill, and it is not the Winston Churchill you'll be thinking of. This was not a clean, civilized war like they thought it was going to be. The Boers basically staged a guerrilla war. The British rounded up the natives, which is to say the Dutch. Burned crops, kept the natives in essentially concentration camps. And because this was a time before they realized that maybe they should be censoring war coverage, everyone in Britain was able to see how bad things were going. So here's the maps. In fact, Rhodesia, which is literally Cecil Rhodes, was like, we're going to take this land and name it Rhodesia. They were going around to keep the Boers from moving further north. Like, this was literally just to trap them so they could take their diamonds. Like, it's... Yeah. They had discovered diamonds in Transvaal.
So that's what, the natural resource?
Yeah. Because this was before they were... This was before we were going to war for oil. We were going to war for diamonds. Or whatever they had at the time. Here are the Boer guerrilla fighters. It looks like they're in freaking Australia. They're just out in the middle of like the scrubland. And the reason why, here's a young Winston Churchill. Look how little he is. In his big old hat. I think I've got another. Yeah, here he is. Look at him. He's so young. He was probably he was maybe 16, 17, 18. Back then you could go to war early. Which he went as a reporter at first. And then he was like, I got to fight for my country. However, public opinion quickly turned against this war because pictures like this came back. Now, this is a concentration camp in the Boer War. What is the difference between this concentration camp and the one we saw from Germany in Africa?
The ones that had skeletons?
Yeah.
Oh, they look bad. They glow.
Well, yeah, but what's the difference? Yeah. There were white people in these concentration camps. Uh-oh, we can't have that. These look like Europeans because they were Dutch. Can't do that. We can't be putting white people in concentration camps. Yeah, so that was the big issue. Anyway, we're done with the chapter. Colonization changed the world, obviously. Exhaustion, Napoleonic Wars, countries were financially broken, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the natives saw this expansion as just foreign invasion because it was. Local laws, customs, and traditions were overridden, and resistance was, of course, the result. So, next chapter is liberalism and the making of mass society. So, more like shifting in culture and leading up to World War I, which is chapter 22. So, I'll see you on Monday.
Okay, so basically, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be here all next week, right? I'm going to be here, but that week after, like the 20th and the 22nd, I'm not going to be here because I have to learn safety for my job.
Okay.
I don't know if there's going to be a test or something.
There shouldn't be another test. The third test will just be the final. We don't have time. We don't have time for a third test before the final.
Oh, okay, so the final will be like on the final day, right?
Yeah.
Because ain't that 20th, the week before, that's how the last one is.
Yeah, I believe so.
And then there's like, we just saw one more Monday.
Yeah, that Monday will be review day. Because, yeah, Yeah, I'm looking at because the 20th and 22nd, and then after that is the 27th, which will be our review day.
Okay, so my math teacher, she let me reschedule my test, but then we didn't see my little meeting, because the day number one meeting is really like test days.
Hmm.
She said that I can do my test, but I cannot do it later. I can do it later. I have to do it
Do it
early.
early? Ew. Well, no, you'll be